tonight. So if you plan to purchase a copy of his book, you might want to do that before you sit down, but they will also be available after the talk as well. And again, we'll start in about 3 minutes. Thank you.
Good evening. Welcome to the Tippy McMichael lecture tonight. I'm Janet Alured, member of the church here. I'm going to give you some information about the lecture series itself, and then I'll turn it over to our rector here, and he will introduce our speaker. So a little bit about Tippy. Clifton Reed McMichael, nicknamed Tippy, was a lifelong member of St. Paul's. She followed the tradition of her grandparents, a pioneer Fayetteville family, who also were members of St. Paul's in the late 19th century. As a young child, Tippy contracted polio and therefore had to rely on crutches or a wheelchair in her adult life. In 1939, she graduated from the University of Arkansas, and unusual for a woman of her time, Tippy had a full-time professional career during World War II at Fort Chaffee, and later an executive position at U.S. Steel in St. Louis. She's remembered as a feisty, strong-willed woman of independent mind. At her death, she left a bequest of 1/3 of her estate, approximately $1.5 million, to enhance the life and work of the church. The Tippy McMichael Lecture Series was created from her gift as an expression of thanksgiving and a memorial to her. It does still take donations from parishioners and friends of St. Paul's. The lecture series is an offering to the community. The lectures are intended to explore a wide range of spiritual issues and feature accomplished speakers from varied disciplines and different religious traditions. Tonight we are very pleased to have pastor, author, and permaculturalist, I had to practice that word, Ragan Sutterfield, an Arkansas native, as invited speaker. Rector Evan Garner will now introduce him.
Thank you, Janet. And I want to say a big thank you to all of the people who work hard to make this evening possible. Thank you to the representatives from St. Spatula's Guild who are here, the members of the Tippy McMichael Committee who are here, and also those who have worked behind the scenes. I am really grateful. One of the best parts of this job, as I bet Lowell will agree, is the chance to spend time with some really bright, exciting people who have gifts to share with our congregation, and to be able to welcome them. And the only way that is possible is because of the generosity of the people of this parish. So thank you very much. It's also a chance to say, if you like lectures, if you like entertaining guests, if you like working behind the scenes so that we can bring other guests here, the Tippy McMichael Committee might be a great way for you to serve. It's a group of about 12 people who do all sorts of things like pick up people from the airport and serve wine. So lots of those things. But they also get a chance to dream and invite and poll members of the congregation who might have ideas for future speakers. So if that's something that interests you, I hope you'll let me know. I'd be happy to put you in touch with members of the Tippy McMichael Committee. I met Ragan when I moved here. Ragan's been a priest in the Diocese of Arkansas for a while, and he's the kind of person that sticks out because he's got a lot to say about a lot of different topics. And when Ragan says something, I'm usually really glad to listen. So any chance I get, I want to spend time with Ragan. We've traveled some together. We spend time at clergy conference together. But any chance I get to share ministry or share space with Ragan, I consider that a privilege. Ragan is a really, really thoughtful person. And I really enjoy spending time with him, but in some ways we're kind of opposites. I talk a lot and I'm loud, and Ragan's a really good listener. And when he speaks, people listen because he doesn't oversay it. He says it, and when he does, it's just exactly what I need to hear. And if you've ever been around someone like that, you know the joy that it is to be in their company. I've heard Ragan speak a lot about issues of ecology and environmental preservation. Ragan was a Tippy speaker here a little before I arrived. We think 2018, maybe early 2018 or late 2017. But since then, Ragan has written a new book, and he's here to talk to us tonight a little bit about that book, The Art of Being a Creature. But Ragan will also be with us tomorrow morning for our 10 o'clock adult forum when he's going to dig into the creation story. But he's also going to preach at all three services. So we've got a lot of Ragan this weekend, and I'm grateful for that. At the end of his talk, there will be a time for questions, so I hope you'll stay around. Join me in welcoming Ragan Sutterfield.
Okay, does this work? So it's so wonderful to be back here at St. Paul's. The last time I was here was to talk on the theme of climate grief and how we live into the time of the climate crisis, and that's sort of still my topic. As we know, we are in a time when our ecosystems, the systems of life that sustain us, are in deep trouble. And the question that I continually ask myself is, why? What's the fundamental problem? Is it a problem of our economy? Do we need new technologies? Is it a different question of how we use energy? But as I've reflected on that question, I keep coming back to the fundamental, deep down problem is a crisis of our creatureliness, who we are as creatures. What does it mean to live as a creature in this world? Now, I'm not the only one who has settled on this as being the source of our problem. The former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, wrote that we have lost the art of being creatures. When I first read that, he didn't provide any immediate answers to how do we recover that art. So that too has been a question that's been sitting with me. And in particular, how do we as human beings recover the art of being the particular kinds of creatures that we are called to be? I'm someone who likes to dig in the dirt. I'm not a great gardener, but I like to be involved with the soil and be out in creation, not only observing it, but also working to cultivate and bring a greater abundance of life into my own particular little yard and also to encourage it in other places. And in doing that, I've begun to learn more about the nature of soil. And as I've learned about soil, I've been reminded that soil is, in many ways, the root of who we are as human beings. Now, this isn't something that's just in the fact that we all eat from the soil, that we all live every day, from energy derived from the soil, but that also our very words for what it means to be human come from soil, the human from the humus. And the Hebrew Bible also echoes this with the Adam, who comes from the Adamah. So this book is the result of my thinking through these connections. And like the soil, it's a mix of a lot of different things, reflections on life, on ancestors, on the nature of clay. And so what I'd like to do this evening is share with you a few selections from this book, which is the culmination of many years. I've written 3 other books, but I started work on this book before any of them. So this is something I've been thinking about and working on for a long while. And it's my best attempt to explore what it means to be a human creature and how we can begin to live in a different way into this time of ecological crisis that will hopefully bring a little bit of healing here and there. So I'm going to start with the very beginning of the book, and this is just a little piece on clay. Here it is red, white, and gray, veins running close to the surface. Dig half a foot, and clay begins to show a slimy mix easily rubbed into a ball. Where the creeks have run for any length of time, the banks are made of its mud, rocks jutting out here and there, the ancient sediments becoming slick in the rain. Mixed in are layers of shell, the now fossil clay of eons past, when the mountains here had not yet crested. It was a shallow sea, I'm told. A few miles away, I once found shark teeth in a roadside wash. Another time, it was the stem of a crinoid, reminders that this place has been many things before I or any of my kind came to know it. In a soil test of the simplest kind, a bit of backyard dirt shaken in a jar of water, it is clay that is the last to fall from the suspension. Compared to sand and silt and the organic matter of dead plants and animals, it is the smallest particle of soil, a crystalline structure made from rock eroded and eroded again until it is so small it is almost elemental. That, or churned up from the deep of the earth, synthesized in the very heart of the planet. Both kinds of clay exist, buttered through the layers of the ground. Small, volatile, reactive. Clay is both plastic when wet and hard when fired. Shape it into any form, then heat it until it becomes like stone. Clay tablets are the oldest known medium for writing. Angled, wedge-shaped forms pressed into a flattened lump. Clay pots have been dated to 16,000 years ago. Few artifacts, save those made of stone, last so long. I have a shard of pottery. I was given as a boy a piece a friend found broken in a field. It had been made by an indigenous person centuries or millennia before. In the pink earthenware, I can see the fingerprints of the potter, where she pressed her thumbs, forming a pattern like a woven basket in the plastic earth. I like to pick it up from time to time and run my fingers over her prints, a momentary connection to a past still present in clay. Complex and abundant, malleable and ionic, clay could have been the beginning of that potter, the tree under which she sat, the dog running through the village along the riverbank. Clay could have been the beginning of us all. All of those molecules of clay floating around in the earth are electric, popping with charges seeking balance, churning in the earth, bonding together, trading electrons. Perhaps somewhere 4 billion years ago, patterns began to emerge. There's a theory, minority but serious, that claims that clay was the beginning of life. In it, clay crystals began to shape their environments in small ways, sign of life 1. Then those patterns began to be replicated through a kind of low-tech gene, sign of life 2. With time, the reactions became more complex. Amino acids and nucleic acids were synthesized and incorporated. It was like kindling, dry, brittle, ready for a blaze, then the fire. The spark of the spirit brooding over the waters, a random catalyst in the ground. Somehow, some way, life began from dead matter, the elements synthesized in the nuclear fission of stars gathered into something altogether new. From there, we imagine a life that continued to push towards the surface, some amphibious creature crawling out from the primordial soup. We are oriented toward the surface. And that's where we center the story, the great leaps of life. But our true source remains in the depths. The life that we see and interact with day to day, the trees and people and pets, the birds in our yards, the rabbits in our gardens, those are only a small fraction of the respiring, replicating, gene-passing creatures on Earth. Measured by mass, the total life beneath the surface may exceed that on top. And those of us who live on the surface, building new towers to the sky, dreaming of colonies on the moon, lives in simulation, we still depend on the depths and live by their mercy. Somewhere there must be a body, and with it a world grounded in the earth, made possible by microbes. The ancients had it right. The human from the humus, the Adam from the Adamah. We do not live on earth, but from it. The soil's health is ours. And for those who sense some wrong, some disease in human life with which we've all become infected, perhaps it is back to the soil that we should return to begin our healing. Maybe our hope is not in the new, in the discoveries of the latest science put to work by the most innovative technologies. Perhaps we are called to begin where we are, letting go of the temptations of long journeys and grand plans, as we learn again what is right beneath our feet. And through attention to the earth itself, we may discover the lost art of being human, creatures born from clay, spirit-filled soil. So as we go through this time together, I know I want to have time for conversation. And so perhaps we'll have more extended time at the end, but I do invite you, after I read some of these various sections, if you do have any more immediate questions about what I've just read, I'm glad. If you're like me, you may have forgotten that passage by the time we get to the end. So if you have anything as we go, please feel free to ask it.
Questions or comments?
That was beautiful, Ragan. I love well-written prose, and so the poetry speaks to the meaning of it. And I want to share a thought that my uncle gave my husband, and when he had inherited the family land, about 40 acres outside of Bentonville. And he said that when he decided to put it up for sale, he got several people who were interested in not just to develop it, they were interested in the topsoil, because there's so few places that have like the untouched topsoil like relatively untouched, but at least for decades, that so much of the earth has already been kind of pillaged, violated. And I was just struck at how that can happen over time when we don't even realize it. And then as we're kind of flailing around looking for meaning and connection and belonging, and there's no like natural soil in which we can really sink our fingers. I mean, so you might speak more to that as we go along, but that was a thought that came to mind.
Yeah. So were they interested in mining the
They
topsoil?
wanted to buy the topsoil.
Okay.
He didn't sell it to them.
Yeah, so that's a really important topic, and it's something that I always try to really keep in mind anytime you go to a hardware store or garden center and buy a bag of topsoil. It's coming from somewhere. And the same with the river gravel and the sand. And I knew a farmer in Morrilton, and he said that he could make more from selling his soil than from the crops that he could grow out of it. And I think that's an economy that is out of order when that's the truth. But paying attention to where those things come from, but also how we can develop soil where we are. And there's a great agrarian writer named Gene Logston, and he says that if you can leave whatever land you have with 5% organic matter, then you have accomplished more than any philosopher or any priest or any. You have done something great, and you could put that on your tombstone. And I always keep that in mind. So one of the ways that we can build soil is through composting. And that's something that I've spent a lot of time trying to learn how to do well and to bring in organic matter. And so the next passage that I'd like to share with you is on exactly that topic. And it's about, so I start off, I won't read the whole chapter, but I start off talking about my habit of stealing leaves from my neighbors' lawns. So pretty soon, there will be bags of leaves all around, and I like to go along. Thursdays are my day off usually, and that's when a lot of people have their yard waste out in my area of Little Rock, and so I feel like I'm doing something, like I'm wrong, pulling up in my car, jumping out, throwing the leaves in the back. But I take those leaves because I'm wanting to incorporate more organic matter into the soil. And particularly in my backyard, I spend a lot of time in the book writing about my backyard, which is, at one time was just urban infill. It was just clay and rock and shell and zero organic matter. And so slowly but surely, it's still a work in progress, bringing in organic matter. But we can accelerate that process through learning to compost. So I'm going to read just a bit from that chapter. Composting, I have found, is more a way of life than a garden activity. It transforms how I see the world and interact with it. Everything becomes potential soil, a green or a brown, a source of carbon or nitrogen to be mixed in the ratio that will heat the pile and turn it to rich humus, fragrant like a forest floor. shredded paper, cardboard boxes, table scraps, manure, urine, distillery grains, the list could go on. Nearly every artifact of organic life is a potential source for new soil. To become that soil, though, it must all be brought together in the right ratios and allowed to transform into the new stuff of living humus. In this way, compost can be compared to a form of prayer, or a living metaphor for it. It is a spiritual discipline that, like fasting, is useful for its own ends, but even more so as a means of entering a new relationship with the energies of the world. The Augustinian monk and teacher Martin Laird writes that, like compost, prayer breaks down into fertile matter for the life around it. Prayer matures by a process of breaking down rather than by acquisition and spiritual prowess. To allow prayer to break down requires humility and waiting. It takes welcoming even the discarded and the dead into the potential for new life. As Laird writes elsewhere, what gardener condemns the compost for being full of rubbish? So it is with the life of prayer, indeed, the life of faith. We take it all in, the good and the bad, and we let it settle and mix and be transformed by the invisible life that works always in and around us. The virtue that is required for this work to take place is humility, the rejection of power and prowess in favor of going down and letting go to discover again the truly human form. True humility, writes Laird, is the wide open space of self-knowledge that opens onto God. Essential to that self-knowledge is an acknowledgement of our mortality. For compost to become humus, death must be involved. And for us to become humble, renewing and recovering the art of creaturely life, death will inevitably be a part of that too. The best prayer, like the best composting, is that which enters the truth of that death and is released to the life that sustains through it and beyond it. This is the life of a creature made and sustained by God, a creature who has abandoned all to the perfect humility that is the unfathomable love of God, who is the ground of our being. One of the connections that I'm working with throughout this book is the idea that humility as a virtue. You know, we talk a lot about humility in our faith, and there's good reasons to think that humility is a strongly Christian virtue. I mean, the Romans had no concept of it. Aristotle didn't include it in his list of virtues. The idea that we would deliberately choose a path of self-emptying and giving is something that we deeply learn through the Christian faith. But what is humility exactly? I think we can get confused about it sometimes and think that it's just a woe is me, let's beat up on ourselves, I'm not good sort of attitude. And you certainly find a lot of that throughout the history of Christians interpreting and trying to understand it. But what I'm interested in is the idea that humility, the way that the word works, is literally a going close to the humus, and that you go down low to the ground. And when we go down towards the humus, that's where we, I think, can begin to understand and discover a way to renew our humanity. And so that path of humility going down, renewing our humanity, and then growing and living more vibrant and flourishing lives from that I think is the spiritual journey that thinking about soil in connection to these things can really help us toward. So any questions or comments on that? Or?
When I was growing up in Texas, in West Fort Worth suburb, and our backyard was the standard fill, and when it rained, the water would just sit. And so my father was collecting the neighbors' leaves 40 years ago and longer, and composting in our backyard, and eventually it became the most lush, green backyard garden, and it was wonderful. He was one to read Mother Earth News and organic gardening, and so I'm really relating to what you're saying, and thank you.
Well, thank you. It sounds like your father was on track long before most of us. So that way in which soil can start to change, the structure of soil can begin to change with the introduction of organic matter. So soil is held together by different kinds of bonds and carbon structures. And what they found is that when organic matter is introduced, part of it is providing food for all kinds of microbes. And those microbes begin to make room for themselves. And so they start to work to change the structure of the soil so that there's more surface area in the soil, so more microbial life. And so it keeps kind of building upon itself. But then it also starts to be able to retain and hold more water so that either water won't just pass through in more sandy soils, or it won't collect on the top and not go down in more clay soils. And so there's this amazing work of interactions going on all the time right beneath the soil. If you take just a little handful of soil, there are billions of organisms in that soil. Carl Sagan is famous for talking about the billions of stars out in the cosmos. Well, there's billions of living things in a handful of soil, and they're doing all kinds of amazing work. I mean, some of them emit electrochemical pulses that draw roots down to themselves. Some of them are working to create glues called glomalins that start to change that structure of the soil, and that's just to mention some of the bacterial forms. So there's a lot going on there in the soil. So one of the other parts of living into humility is a kind of surrender, recognizing that we are finite creatures. We are not gods. That becomes the confusion a lot of times along the way, is this attempt to create a sense that we are the masters of our lives and of the universe, rather than simply fragile, finite beings in the midst of something larger. And so I'm often reminded of this through reading some of the best of the Psalms. And so I want to share with you a little selection about some experiences an experience I had with trying to rescue an owl, and the lesson that it taught me along with Psalm 104. And I'll say as a preface, I did an apprenticeship in sheep farming for many years. I've actually raised sheep and pigs and cattle and chickens, and that was where I first really started to learn about composting. But so this is about a time when I was doing that. I'm sorry, it's on page 59. So. One morning during my sheep farming days, I came to check the animals just as dawn was breaking. There in the woven fence near the barn, a great horned owl was trapped, talons tangled in the wire. It is not uncommon for owls to meet their end in fences, hidden in the night even from their keen eyes. I've seen dead owls in fences before, but thankfully this one was still alive. When I approached her, I moved slowly, carefully. I had dealt with injured wild birds before, but never a raptor like this. Her talons were fierce, and her beak a bladed edge that could easily have sliced my skin. But the whole time I worked to untangle her, after what I'm sure had been a whole night of struggle, she looked at me through the perfect circles of her yellow eyes, steady and acquiescent. In her look, I could sense a kind of trust. I was her only hope of getting free, and she seemed to have accepted that. To fully be a creature is to live with that gaze of helpless trust. This does not mean that we cannot live our free and wild lives. Instead, even in our freedom, we must recognize that we are dependent, that every moment of our lives is a gift and a grace. Our freedom is fragile, our lives tenuous. Humility is the gaze of trusting dependence that recognizes that we need help to live into our fullness, to achieve our wholeness. In the great creation song of Psalm 104, there is an image of that gaze. After naming the span of creatures from flocks to cedars, from birds to human beings, to the sea monster, Leviathan, the psalmist prays, "These all look to you to give them their food in due season. When you give it to them, they gather it up. When you open your hand, they are filled with good things." In that look, I think of the helpless gaze of the owl, the same gaze I saw in the eyes of the rabbit and the junco. It is the gaze of helpless acceptance, the recognition that some power beyond us is interested in our good. This is the gaze that I seek in my own heart, as I recognize that this is not a world of my making. My life is not my own to do with as I please, but a gift born of relationship, a gift that needs food in due season, and the continued breath of God's Spirit to go on living. The psalm continues, "When you hide your face, they are dismayed. When you take away their breath, they die and return to their dust. When you send forth your Spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the ground." Our lives are like moments in the divine breath, inhale and exhale, carbon and oxygen, death and life. It is by God's breath that we live. It is without God's breath that we die. And yet, in this reality, we meet a limit, but not our final end. All life is made and maintained within God, and God is continually renewing and restoring it. When we learn to look at God with the dependent gaze of a helpless creature, we accept a posture that transforms even our death. Life, in all its difficulties, no longer betrays us. Instead, we are able to rest in the world, hoping and yet suffering, living through each moment not as an opportunity for our ambition, but as a gift that we must savor. Our lives become moments between joy and grief. We become a breath inhaled, the body blooming in the red burst of life, a breath exhaled, flesh broken and given to the world. I'm curious if any of you have ever had similar experiences with wild creatures. Evan and I just met a woman earlier today who was telling us about rescuing a hawk that behaved in a similar way. Yes.
A fox came up to my patio, and my dogs went after the fox. And I always thought fox ran in a circle and kind of tricked the dogs, but this fox didn't. So I had to go pull my dogs off of the fox, and then I called a friend that connected with a wildlife rescue person. But I got to sit with the fox. The fox was in shock, and talk to the fox and have a real connection. It was such a beautiful animal. I don't know, at least for 30 minutes, I sat with the fox. And she was sitting up, and so I pet her. I didn't know whether I was supposed to do that or not, but it just kind of needed that.
Yeah.
And I talked with her, and then the wildlife woman got there, and they gave her IVs, but she didn't make it. But I'm so thankful for that time with the fox.
Thank you. Yeah. I started, this chapter actually begins with talking about a rabbit that we tried to, my daughters and I rescued from a cat that had, we found had a baby rabbit. And yeah, it's sometimes they make it, sometimes they don't. But that up close experience can be really rich. So part of the reason that Evan and I were in this particular conversation today was I've been drawn to a movement that's been beginning in the country for conservation burial, which is a way of thinking about burial where the body naturally is placed in the earth in a shallower grave that allows for more natural decomposition. There's nothing magical about 6 feet. It's just kind of a random number they came up with. And conservation burial also works to preserve land, and so the land is managed in a way that enhances the ecology for all the creatures that share that place. So that's something that I'm working on trying to get to Arkansas. But a lot of this book, as I've already mentioned, if we're thinking about soil, then we start to think about death, and particularly the kinds of deaths that we might want for ourselves. How would we like our bodies to be treated after death, and what kind of return and connection could we take part in? Because so many creatures are part of this big network of nutrient cycling that human beings do a pretty good job of removing ourselves from. Whether it's manure or death, we just take ourselves out of the equation of returning ourselves to the earth and participating in this larger cycle. So as a way of reflecting on that in the book, I wrote out a little bit of my last wishes. So this is my sort of not probably going to be followed by anybody, but just an indication of the broader strokes of what I'd like. When I die, leave me be. My body has all it needs for its return. Enzymes in my liver and pancreas will let go and begin their work, digesting my flesh as they once digested food. Leave me as naked as you like, wrap me in a cloth, or put me in a basket woven from the branches of the black willows that grow beside the river, where yellow warblers sing their sweet, sweet, sweet in the spring. There will be a feast, I'm sure. The women of the church always have cookies and sandwiches of pimento cheese ready on a platter. Those should satisfy the human guest. But for the others, offer my body as a banquet, a parting gift to the creatures that gave me years of good health. Let them now feed upon the organs inside, chloroform, E. coli, streptococci, and Pseudomonas aeruginosa, eating up my intestines. Clostridia traveling the passages of the body, feeding as they go. May they go into the world, occupying other stomachs, carrying within them a reminder and a remainder of my body. Place me in a shallow grave, one where already the dead have turned it dark with life. Smell the place. See if you can push your hand down easily. If it smells like a good garden, the scent of the forest floor like the one I laid on as a child, watching, listening, then that is a good place. If you see the castings of worms, the earth digested in their guts by their own mix of microbes, all the better. Bury me deep enough that the coyotes won't pry, not wanting to trouble the neighbors. Give at least a few maggots a chance at the softer tissues. They could take care of more than half my body in a week. Beneath the soil, the beetles will also come, especially the burying kind, the grave diggers of the insect world, ripping small bits of flesh and burying it with their eggs, the rotting nursery of another generation. Eventually, the fungi will take their part, the subterranean decomposers, the great connectors of the soil. They will run their mycelial webs among my remains, searching for nutrients unlocked by feasting microbes, and moving them to the ends of the tree roots to which they are fused in a continuous link, a messy tangle, the one and the many. The fungi are as mysterious as ghosts, invisible as a soul, but evident everywhere in the life springing from the ground. They will return my body to that life, the minor resurrection of a human being, earthling brought to life in earth. When the ground has settled, the mass of my body dissipated in the many-chambered metabolism of the ground, come back to the settled place and plant a tree, something small, a buckeye perhaps. It will bloom red in spring just when the ruby-throated hummingbirds arrive. Imagine my blood in the pigment of the blossoms, my body as nectar for the quick beating wings of the birds with gorgets flashing red as they refract the sun. Imagine my flesh as the sweet dew on the uncurled proboscis of the red admiral, settled, leaf-like, and still. There's a lot of amazing work that happens in the soil to take what's been alive and return it soon after into something that is life-giving for other creatures. And so part of what I think our art as creatures is to pay attention to how what we return to the earth. There's a helpful book called What We Leave Behind, and talks about, it kind of asks this big question of what is it that we are returning to the earth? What do we leave behind? And it even helps us think about our bodies, because not everything that we leave behind from our own bodies will be nourishing, depending on what how we fed and how we lived, and so I think it kind of changes part of our relationship with how we're currently living. So, for instance, there's a farmer who is interested in human manure composting. So, using composting toilets and things, but he says that he would apply this to his garden, but he realized one time after having to take a course of antibiotics for an illness that he had, that he killed a whole garden patch. And it was because the antibiotics killed off all of the microbes in the soil there. And so that's something that we have to think about. What do we leave behind? Yes.
I'm curious how often we physically bury something. The story we heard today, a woman who buried her mare, and our daughter has a friend whose horse died recently, and they buried her, and I thought, like, I dug a grave for a family dog, and that was hard. I cannot imagine digging a grave for a horse. Right? Yeah. Right. Yeah. Back up. But I'm interested in your reflecting and also in just your theological formation. What's the relationship between the impurity associated with touching a corpse and where we've come that the disposal of dead bodies is out of sight, out of mind? And yet, family responsibility is to dispose of their loved one, but not others. And so I'm not asking you to interpret for us exactly how we got where we are, but I'm curious your reflections on the ways in which we have become so removed from not just the disposal of human bodies, but pets and other animal bodies. How has that shaped our inability to be in touch with the ecology more generally?
That's a really good question. I think it's been this kind of slow subtraction in which we have become, first of all, less and less familiar with a wide range of animal life. So you imagine people who live in more direct resource economies, they must. So I talk a little bit about in the book, and I'm not going to pretend to be able to pronounce but there's a group of indigenous people in the Kalahari that have lived there. It's one of the longest running, probably the longest continuous culture in the world. And there's a wonderful book by an anthropologist named James Sussman called Affluence Without Abundance. And what he explores with them is how they live in this profound direct resource economy where they have no storage and they just collect what they need directly from their environment, whether it's game or plants, and they have this tremendous understanding of what's there. At one time, most of us had something like that. Even several generations ago with farming, when most people had some direct relationship with farming, you had a more intimate relationship with the creatures that shared that place. Some of them would be adversaries. That fox might be the thing after your chickens, but you're watching and you're in relationship. And we've slowly become divorced from that in such a way that I think now dealing with a body of any kind it's just so unfamiliar to us. So I raised chickens for a little while, and I would sell both eggs and meat. And I had one customer come and say that she did not like the whole chickens because they looked like a chicken. And I get that. I mean, that says a lot about because so much of our meat is now just this, and our Cargill for a while talked about what they provide as protein solutions. Instead of calling it a meat company, they provide protein solutions. And so this is I think it's all related to now our problem with even just a dead body of any kind. and not seeing the kinds of continuity and similarities with other kinds of animal life and death. So I don't know if that answers or helps. Well, I know we're coming up against our time, and I don't want to keep anyone too late, and I'd love to have a little more time for questions after, but eschatology, last things, is a really important topic. And I think it's an important topic both because our world is one where people are thinking a lot about last things. What's the end? How is it going to end? Is that going to be a good end or a bad end? I think the mood is towards the negative. But how do we live into that? So towards the end of my book, this is page 164. I try to reflect on that, and it's a kind of question that I take from. There are these two permaculture writers, Jonathan Bates and Eric Toensmer, who write about a project where they took this little yard in Holyoke, Massachusetts, Mount Holyoke, Massachusetts, and they turned it into this food forest. It was just like a little yard in a duplex, and they had all kinds of different foods growing all year round. They could go out and harvest, and the name of their book is Paradise Lot, and I like that idea because I think there's something to be said about beginning to live into the future that we desire and the future that we expect, particularly those of us who are Christians. And so that's what I explore a little bit here. My wife texts me as I prepare to lead a Eucharist. It's a Tuesday, an election day in November. Anxiety is again high, as it now always seems to be on such days. My church has chosen to worship God rather than enter the frantic waiting for the polls to close. Our concern is not who will win Congress, who will be our next governor. Those are not bad concerns, but they are not the determining factors of our hope. It was fitting then that Emily wrote to remind me to order trees. We're continuing our work to provide more habitat in our yard, to rewild it, or as the landscape designer Benjamin Voigt prefers to put it, we're seeking to practice reconciliation ecology. Our trees won't be ready until the midwinter, when all seems dead and dormant, but it is then that trees are best established. As the local nursery website puts it, midwinter is tree planting season, a kairos time, in what Christina Rossetti so beautifully named the bleak midwinter. Our God, heaven cannot hold him, nor earth sustain. Heaven and earth shall flee away when he comes to reign. In the bleak midwinter, a stable place sufficed, the Lord God Almighty, Jesus Christ. It's my favorite Christmas hymn. To plant trees, pressing into the wet clay of the saturated earth of the winter ground, is an act of welcoming the season of incarnation, a renewal made possible by small things. As Rossetti expresses it, the God who is beyond all was satisfied to dwell in the particular of a place, to be born in a stable. And in that incarnation, Christ established a new reality, a season of new life that was seeded even in the midwinter, planting for the renewal of all things. In Romans 13, Paul is telling us that the situation of the church is in the midwinter. The days have become as short as they will grow, the cold as bitter as it will get. Now is the time to plant trees, to spread the life now dormant that that will grow into the abundance of a garden, a paradise soon enough. Such a paradise is not a future we make, but instead a future we join, a future we are claimed by in Christ. That is the difference between Christian faith and both progressive politics and conservative return. Progress for whom? Progress in what? Return to what? The coming of God's kingdom is the healing of all things. It is the final justice of the world, and it is already arriving both outside of both the future and the past. Our work is to join in that arrival, to hear its song, even when the tune is hard to follow, amid the clanging noise of the machine world. To plant trees is to enter a harmony, a congruence with the future that God is bringing, especially when those trees are species that will serve the diverse life of this particular place. The incarnation is always particular. It is the invitation to the healing of each place according to its own needs. And this, I think, is true of the coming of God into the world once again. I think that would be part of my call to you as you go on about your days and weeks to come, is to think about how to live into some congruence with the future God is making and the way that the world is to be, and that we can begin that work even in the midwinter time that we're in. I'm working now on an essay about fly fishing in a polluted creek by my house, and so it's this place with graffiti and just trash everywhere, but it's this creek that's been running for probably thousands of years through my neighborhood, and there are fish in it, and I got a fly fishing rod for my brother-in-law not long ago, and needed a place to go try it out, and so I went down there and did some fly fishing and caught some fish. And I think that in that action, I'm in a way relating to the creek as it should be, not as a polluted place, not as a place that's not living into its flourishing and fullness, but instead I'm treating it as a creek should be treated, and relating to it in that way. And I think that that's part of what our call to do is in all kinds of different spheres and ways, is to live in congruence with the way things should be. So I know we're up against the 8 o'clock hour, but I'm glad to stay here and answer.
What questions or
any
comments do y'all have before we adjourn? Questions or comments? Yeah.
I think I can.
No, people are watching online and they won't be able to hear you, I promise.
Oh, gosh, now I'm embarrassed. I'm not a natural gardener. I've been trying really hard to change my ways. We live in a tract in Bentonville, and it does have the kind of grass where water will sit on it for a day after it rains, just sitting and not being able to go into the ground. But I guess my question about not as much that as your burial. There's so many communities that have laws preventing. I used to work for Habitat on staff in Texas, and a lady had buried all of her pets in the yard of the home that she had lived in and her mother had lived in. And she was asking us to be very cautious because we were tearing that house down and replacing it. And it turns out that was illegal in this county. And, I know my father's family had farmland, and they buried some of their people on the farmland. Mm-hmm. But we can't do that now. So how does the idea of wholeness conflict with the laws that are in place?
That's a really good question, and there are certain restrictions on types of composting and things like that too at times. So I'll answer briefly. I mean, part of, I think, the work is to address those laws where they come up. Some of the burial laws, it really is a county-to-county thing. Like in Arkansas, it's really up to the county. The state is very minimally involved in any kind of burial. And so that's makes it kind of a patchwork, but it also makes it something where many of us have a better shot at influencing county politics than we do state politics. And so there's work that can be done, and in each county with regard to changing laws. But I'll also say that finding small ways to create a difference. You're talking about with your yard. There's a wonderful book called Prairie Up by a man I've quoted in there, Benjamin Voigt, who talks about reconciliation ecology. And he talks you through how to create a prairie sort of lawn. But he goes into like HOAs, homeowners associations, and other, and he's dealt with all of those things. And he has really smart, good ways to, sometimes it can just come down to like borders and ways that you frame it. So I think we have to take small steps where we can.
Who else? Questions or comments? What are some of the things you see being done in Arkansas that give you a lot of hope?
That's a good question to ask. I think that I met someone earlier here who's involved with Arkansas Master Naturalist, and maybe there's more than one here, but I think that's a really wonderful program, and it's a relatively new program that helps us learn not only about the cultivation of better wild spaces, but also just learning the names of things. And I think that naming things is so important. Now that there can be a negative kind of naming in order to control, but we also, if we don't know the names of things, then we can't be in relationship with them. And so that's something that I think is really important. And like I know the names of a lot of birds, but I don't know the names of a lot of plants. And so I'm working on learning that. And when we begin to learn those names, then it just expands really our sense of the diversity and wonder of what's around us. And so I'm very hopeful about that. And then also the people who are working to protect very particular places. So in Little Rock, they were filling in this wetland that a lot of birdwatchers like to go to, and a lot of the birdwatchers kind of got up in arms about it, and weren't able to prevent the filling of that wetland, but were able to work with the city to get an alternative location and get some big funding to create an alternative wetland that will hopefully host a lot of those same species that is just adjacent to it. And I think those little fights add up and are hopeful.
Something that I did for my yard was, after years of it being treated with pesticides and chemicals and Chemlon, that it was a dead yard. It was hard as a rock, no worms, no organic life. So after my divorce, I quit the Chemlon, and I let the dandelions grow. And it's finally getting some organic life back in it. And my neighbor to one side keeps treating his yard, and the water runs off into my yard. But, I try to do little things, and I plant for pollinators, as much as I can. Trees still won't grow in my yard. The roots will, after about 3 years, hit the fill and die. But I'd love to create a prairie front yard, without trees, but with a lot of grasses and native flowers. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in talking about the dandelions, there's part of our work, I think we have an important role to play in cultivating, but also to know that some of those species that move in first into a place that has been harmed are actually healing plants. So, dandelions are not a native flower, but they do have a very strong taproot, and they help break up soil, and they can start to change the soils. I was talking to somebody earlier today about like locust trees. A lot of times will move into an area that's been disturbed, and part of that is they're nitrogen fixers. And so what they're doing is they're working to prepare the soil for other kinds of plants to come in. And so there's a lot of healing that is ready to happen if we can just both get out of the way, but not just get out of the way, but also help cultivate it in the right direction.
Tammy, follow up?
What are some of the native healing plants for Northwest Arkansas? We thought of clover, but maybe there's particular kinds of clover, or do you know of what the healing plants are that aren't necessarily trees?
Sure. I don't know specifics for this region, but I will say that looking at some of the intact prairie places like Evan took me out to Woolsey Wet Prairie, and finding places that have some similar topography to where you are, and looking at some of the plant mixes of what's going on there, and then introducing those plants to your yard can be helpful. But there are so many plants, and plants are so complex. So I do recommend looking at books like Prairie Up, because they really help get into all the details of those sorts of things.
Let's say thank you to Ragan. Thank you, Ragan. Before you leave, if you purchased a book or would like to purchase a book, Ragan will be happy to sign your book at the book table. And if you've got other questions, you can meet him there. Ragan will be back with us tomorrow. He'll be preaching at all 3 services and also speaking at the 10 o'clock hour. So I look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. Thank you all for being here this evening.